Hello, my name is Kenzie Gordon, and I'm a PhD student in Modern Languages and Cultural Studies and the Digital Humanities at the University of Alberta. I'm also a social worker specializing in gender-based violence prevention, and my graduate research looks at relationships between video games and gender-based violence. Although a lot of people think that video games cause violent behavior, research has shown this is not actually the case, and there is a very complex relationship between the violence that we see happening in games and how we actually act in the real world. While a fair bit of research has examined things like gun violence and violent attitudes in general in video games, very little research has looked at how we relate to and interpret representations of sexual and domestic violence in video games, which is what I study. There's a couple different ways to look at this topic. One way takes a typical cultural studies angle by looking at how domestic or sexual violence are represented in mainstream video games. We can look at a game like The Sims, for example, and see how the game lets us play out an abusive relationship. And from the different interactions that are allowed in the game, we can learn things about how the developers of The Sims think about abuse and what kinds of messages players might be receiving from the ways the game lets them play. We can also look at games that have scripted abusive relationships, such as the murder mystery game Heavy Rain, and analyze the portrayals of violence just like we would for a film or a TV show, but with the added element of what it means for the player to participate in the violent relationship as a survivor, perpetrator, or bystander. The other way to look at it is from more of a social sciences perspective, trying to figure out what effects particular interactions have on their players and looking at applied uses of those interactions. For me, that means investigating if and how games could be used in violence prevention education settings. This can mean looking at games that already exist. My master's thesis examined whether the bystander intervention game Decisions That Matter had an effect on players' attitudes towards sexual violence. Or it can mean making games or chunks of games and testing them out with players. There has been very little research on how effective games are for this kind of education, but what we do have is a lot of research on what works well to teach these subjects in person. What my doctoral research will do is take educational interventions that we already know work and see if those methods can be transferred into a game setting, adding another tool for violence prevention to our toolkit. For example, we know that men's attitudes about sexual violence can be positively influenced by interacting with male peers with progressive attitudes. What I want to know is, can their attitudes be positively influenced by interacting with a progressive game character? This research will hopefully help us better understand the role that video games play in how we think about gender-based violence and ways that games can help us to create a safer society for everyone.